This move opens lines for the queen and bishop and stakes a claim in the center, preparing to develop pieces and control key squares. This move, 1, c6, initiates the Caro Kann defense, a solid and positional opening where black aims to build a robust pawn structure and avoid early tactical complications. This move prepares to fianchetto the bishop or develop it to a more central square, aiming for a solid and flexible pawn structure often seen in King's Indian attack setups. This move immediately challenges white's central pawn and opens lines for black's pieces, aiming for an active game and often leading to Scandinavian or Caro Kann defense-related pawn structures. Developing the knight to d2 supports the central pawn on e4 and prepares for a flexible pawn structure, potentially transposing into various Caro Kann or queen's pawn systems while keeping the c-pawn free for development. This move develops a knight to a natural square, supporting the central pawn structure and preparing for queenside expansion while awaiting white's central pawn commitment. This move, ngf3, supports the central e4 pawn and prepares to develop the kingside knight to its most natural outpost, aiming for kingside castling and a solid, flexible pawn structure. This move prepares to support the e5 pawn push and potentially activate the light-squared bishop by clearing the d7 square. By capturing on d5, white opts for a more open position, aiming to develop pieces actively and potentially pressure black's queenside structure, deviating from more common Caro Kann structures. This pawn capture recaptures the central pawn, creating a symmetrical pawn structure in the center for now and opening the c-file for black's rook. This move establishes a central pawn presence, aiming to control key squares and open lines for piece development, reminiscent of a Caro Kann or Slav structure. This move prepares to fianchetto the bishop to g7, reinforcing the kingside and preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, eyeing the black kingside and preparing for kingside castling while supporting the central pawn structure. Developing the bishop to g7 strengthens the kingside diagonal, preparing to castle and contest the open d-file with the rook. This move completes white's kingside development and prepares to potentially launch an attack or reinforce the center, aligning with general opening principles of king safety and piece activation. This move strategically prepares to develop the kingside bishop, reinforcing the pawn center and aiming for a solid, connected pawn structure. This move repositions the rook to the central file, preparing for potential action along the e-file and supporting the central pawn structure. This move correctly develops the knight to its natural square, preparing to castle and potentially contest the center with nf5 or support a central pawn push. The knight repositions to f1, a common retreat in this structure to prepare for a kingside knight maneuver via g3 and h5, or to reinforce the e3 square should black's pawns advance. This move strategically repositions the knight, preparing to contest central squares and potentially support a nb6 advance to pressure white's d4 pawn. This move solidifies white's central pawn structure, preparing to develop the queenside pieces and potentially launch a kingside attack with the reinforced pawn center. With this move, black completes their kingside development, securing their monarch and preparing to potentially challenge white's central control or launch a queenside initiative. This move aims to develop the bishop actively, potentially targeting black's queenside pawn structure and creating a pin on the knight if black plays nf6. This move aggressively challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and potentially create weaknesses in white's king's pawn complex. This repositioning of the knight from f1 to e3 aims to reinforce the center and prepare for a potential queenside expansion with b4, while also freeing the f1 square for the rook. The knight moves to a more active square, challenging white's central pawn and preparing to potentially exploit the d4 pawn or support a further pawn advance on the kingside. This exchange simplifies the pawn structure and opens the d-file, allowing for more active piece play and creating an opportunity to challenge black's central pawn majority. This recapture opens the d-file for white's rook and repositions black's knight to a more active central square, challenging white's central pawn structure. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the d6 pawn and preparing to exert pressure along the a7-1 diagonal. This move proactively prepares to challenge white's centralized knight on e3 and aims to control the e5 square, potentially liberating black's queenside pieces. This move aims to create queenside space and potentially open a file for the rook after the pawn advances. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially eyeing the kingside and supporting pawn advances while also connecting the rooks. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to destabilize black's queenside pawn structure and create weaknesses, potentially opening lines for white's pieces. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, challenging white's central pawn majority and preparing to contest the d4 square. White exchanges the bishop for the knight to gain a favorable pawn structure and prepare for aggressive pawn pushes on the queenside. Black recaptures the pawn, opening the c-file for potential rook activity and challenging white's central control while also preparing to develop the queenside pieces more actively. By exchanging the bishop for a knight, white aims to simplify the position, potentially opening the d-file and creating long-term weaknesses for black's pawn structure. This pawn recapture on e5 is a critical moment, resolving the tension in the center and opening the f-file for black's rook, which can now be activated and potentially support a kingside attack or control the open file. This move prepares to reroute the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside attack or centralizing the piece for defense. This move shores up the kingside pawn structure and prepares for potential advances or defensive maneuvers, while also preventing white from exploiting the g5 square with a bishop. This move aims to simplify the position by exchanging pieces, relieving pressure on white's d-pawn and potentially opening up lines for white's rooks. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the advanced d4 pawn and preparing to contest control of the long diagonal. This move ncx e5 strategically resolves the tension in the center by capturing a pawn, forcing black to recapture and simplifying the position while opening up attacking possibilities. For white, this recapture on e5 simplifies the position, resolving the tension in the center and preparing to contest the now open d-file for potential endgame advantages. This move decisively resolves the tension in the center and removes black's active knight, simplifying the position and preparing to exploit white's material advantage. This exchange simplifies the material, leading to an endgame where white's central pawn majority on the queenside offers positional advantages. This move capitalizes on the discovered attack after black's bishop retreated, winning a piece and simplifying into a favorable endgame for white. After a complex exchange of pieces, black recaptures on f7, aiming to consolidate material and activate the rook into the center, while white's king remains exposed. The rook now occupies the open e-file, preparing to potentially double rooks and exert pressure on black's queenside pawn weaknesses. The rook is now centrally placed on an open file, aiming to contest control of the d-file and potentially support pawn advances later. This move repositions the rook to the more active central file, preparing to challenge black's control and potentially exploit any weaknesses on the e-file. This move repositions the rook to the d-file, which is now open and contested, preparing to challenge white's rook and potentially exert pressure on the central pawn structure. This move prepares to expand on the queenside, aiming to create a passed pawn or gain space for white's pieces by challenging black's pawn structure. This move aims to contest the open c-file, which is crucial for controlling central lines and potentially creating an attack on white's king or queenside. This move aims to centralize the rook, connecting the rooks and potentially preparing to contest the open c-file or support a pawn advance. On the queenside, the king repositions to a more active central square, anticipating the upcoming pawn exchange and preparing to support the rooks on the open d-file. This move prepares to advance the kingside pawns, potentially creating a passed pawn or opening lines for the rook to participate in the attack on the king. The rook aggressively penetrates the 7th rank, threatening to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and create weaknesses. This move forces the black king to a more exposed position, aiming to exploit the open file after the rook captures the knight. The king centralizes, seeking active participation in the endgame and potentially creating defensive and attacking opportunities. This move activates the rook to an open file, aiming to pressure black's king and potentially create further threats along the 6th rank. The rook on f7 is strategically placed to contest the open f-file, crucial for potential kingside play and defending against white's central pawn majority. This exchange simplifies the material, leading to a rook endgame where white can exploit the open file and black's compromised king position. With the exchange of rooks, black's king becomes an active piece in the endgame, seeking centralization to support its remaining pawns and potentially create counterplay. The rook on e5 now actively controls the crucial e-file and prepares to infiltrate black's position, aiming to exploit the weak pawn structure and potential king safety issues. This is a crucial moment where black seeks to activate their rook to exploit the open d-file and potentially create counterplay, while white must maintain vigilance against further threats. This move activates the king, bringing it into the game to support the remaining pawns and potentially participate in the endgame. This pawn push aims to attack the white rook on e6 and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside, disrupting white's control of the center and preparing to activate the king. This pawn capture is part of a plan to open the a-file for white's rook, aiming to create threats against black's king or potentially win material. The capture recaptures the pawn, opening the a-file, which now becomes white's primary avenue for pressure against black's remaining queenside pawns. This move solidifies the kingside pawn structure, preventing any immediate kingside breaks by black and preparing to potentially activate the king or transfer pieces to the queenside. This move is excellent as it actively contests the open d-file and prepares to activate the rook, potentially creating threats against white's king or pawn structure. The rook on b5 now eyes the vulnerable pawn on b6, creating a tactical threat of winning material and disrupting black's pawn structure. Black captures the pawn, centralizing the rook and aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure while creating counterplay on the open c-file. This rook sacrifice at b6 aims to disrupt black's coordination and open lines for white's rooks to Penetrate the queenside pawn structure. This move initiates a kingside pawn push to create a passed pawn on h5, aiming to restrict white's rook and potentially create counterplay by forcing white's pieces to defend. The rook check forces the king to the only safe square, consolidating the rook's position on the 7th rank where it is very active and restricts the black king's movement. The king is exposed, and black's primary goal should be to consolidate and defend, rather than seeking active counterplay which could lead to further complications. This pawn push initiates a race to promote the queenside passed pawn, aiming to create a decisive material advantage. The rook on b3 actively reclaims the file and supports the pawn advance on the queenside, aiming to create a passed pawn. The pawn break with b6 creates a passed pawn on the queenside, which will require black's full attention and potentially weaken their king's defenses. This rook move aims to create an active position, potentially challenging the white pawn structure and looking to exploit the open files that might arise. The king must now become an active participant in the endgame, and this move centralizes it, preparing to support the remaining pawns and potentially participate in opposition or infiltration. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, aiming to control the 7th rank and potentially create threats against white's king or advanced pawns. This move aims to activate the rook on the 8th rank, creating threats against black's king and potentially forcing further pawn concessions or structural weaknesses. The king's central placement on g7 aims to consolidate its position. Prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, and keep options open for connecting the rooks should black's rook on b2 advance further down the 2nd rank. White advances the f-pawn to support a potential central pawn push or to open lines for the rook, aiming to exploit black's slightly awkward pawn structure on the kingside. This move is a tempo-gaining check that forces white's king to a less active square, preparing to bring the rook to the g-file to threaten the pawn or potentially attack the king later. This move initiates a king march to the queenside, aiming to support the passed pawn on b6 and create counterplay against black's slightly exposed king. The king continues its active centralizing journey, aiming to participate in the endgame by covering key squares and supporting the pawn advance. The king now moves to a more central and active position, aiming to support the pawn majority on the kingside and potentially participate in the endgame play. The king retreats to g7, offering a safer square away from the pawn chain and potential checks, while preparing to support the pawn advance on the kingside if the opportunity arises. White's king calmly repositions towards the center, a crucial step in this simplified endgame where centralized kings are vital for both attack and defense. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, aiming to penetrate white's kingside and exploit potential weaknesses around the weakened pawn structure. The rook on c8 now activates by controlling the open c-file, aiming to pressure black's pawn structure and potentially create threats against the king.